notes are up. But the exercising in the cold bit is much shorter than the altitude and the heat. There's not really any adaptations going on, so it's just understanding the acute response to working in the cold. There's not kind of a training effect of being out in the cold, unfortunately. So there's not a lot for you to cover on your own there. I think you'll be just fine. So today we're going to look at start the altitude information, and then hopefully on Monday I can get the rest. If I don't get finished with altitude, I can finish that and get the heat stuff done. So I might be going a little quick. If I go too quick, yell at me, okay? And I think it's really interesting because where we live, we've got all three of these going on, right? So it's from a personal perspective, I think it's a really interesting chapter for us. So just a little bit of language just so that you're following the terms that are being used. Barometric pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury, and it's how much pressure the atmosphere above you is pushing down on you with. So the higher up we go, the lower the barometric pressure because the depth of the atmosphere is shorter. Right? And then temperature is the current temperature of the air that's surrounding you. And relative humidity and air saturation are interchangeable. So the percentage of water vapor that the air is holding. All right? So that humidity and the temperature come back and play quite a big role when we look at the heat information. Okay, so there's not a lot of problems for anaerobic athletes when we look at altitude. We're mainly considering the impact on aerobic athletes, okay? Or sports that have an aerobic component to them. So the initial kind of drop, small drop in performance is just around 2,500 feet. But it's not a big problem at that point. The 5,000 feet is generally when you look at a textbook or you're reading an article that's talking about altitude, they would be talking about 5,000 or above. 5,000 is the point where declines in aerobic performance become much more noticeable. So here we're just around 4,000 feet, so we're just under that. By the time you get to Albuquerque, you're at 5,000, right? And if you go to Cloudcroft, we're at 10,000. And if you go up on Sandia Peak, you're at 10,000. So we've got not very far to go before we're in an area where we would expect to see quite a big drop in our aerobic performance. So 7,250 feet is the threshold for really dramatic effects, right? So we start to see impaired oxygen consumption, so VO2 max goes down considerably, and that impacts endurance performances if you haven't been training at that altitude. We see a decline in aerobic metabolism, so using System 3 becomes harder and harder, and so your body starts to rely more on system 2, all right, which is fine, but system 2 means you fatigue quicker, right? So you can't maintain a level of performance for as long, or you have to really slow down, right? When we look at high altitude winter sports, so downhill skiing or mountain climbing, then they're often way above this threshold. Okay?
So like if you're training for some like big event, is it better to go up in the mountains to train, or is it better to go like closer to sea level?
If the event is going to be at altitude, it's better to go up and train at altitude if you can. If the event is going to be at sea level, you can go up and train at altitude, and that will benefit a performance at sea level, but you've only got 5 to 7 days from coming down from the mountain. So if it's a 2-week or a 3-week event, then you're going to have lost the benefit of the altitude training before the event is finished.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So like at the beginning of every cross-country season, before cross-country season, we do like a high-altitude training camp for like a week or something, but you just said after a few days it just goes away.
Well, we're not at sea level, remember?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you go up to Cloudcroft, say, and then you come back down here, you're going to lose some of that benefit, but you won't lose all of it because we're still at 4,000 feet. So, and even training at 4,000 feet, if you go down to sea level, you'll have a benefit. It's just not as much as if you go over 5,000. So hypoxia is the fancy term for poor delivery of oxygen to the tissues, particularly muscle tissue. All right. So when we're looking at this, you've got to be a little bit careful about your terminology, because you often hear that there is less oxygen at altitude. That's not entirely true. The percentage of oxygen within the air is exactly the same wherever you are on the planet. It's 20.93%, period. Right? It's 20.93% in London, it's 20.93% in Mexico City. So the percentage of oxygen is the same. The difference is the drop in barometric pressure. All right? And it's going to come back, we're going to look at a diagram in a minute, it comes back to that high-low pressure gradient idea that we talked about quite a long time ago now. Okay? So the drop in barometric pressure reduces the partial pressure of oxygen, so my slope gets less steep, and that makes it harder to move oxygen back and forwards across the membranes. Okay? All right, so then we have some other issues is that as we get higher in altitude, it gets colder, all right? Cold air can't hold water vapor as well as warm air can. So the higher I go, the greater the risk of getting dehydrated because there's less water vapor in the air, all right? And we see an increase in solar radiation the closer to the sun. I mean, it sounds a bit silly because the sun's so far away, but you know, that extra 5,000, 7,000 feet makes a difference in the UVA and UVB radiation that you're receiving. All right? So really, really important that you use your sunscreen, even if you're going skiing. A lot of people get sunburned when they ski because they think, oh, it's cold, I'm up a mountain, you know, I don't need sunscreen, and it's sunny and the sun bounces off the snow into their face and then they get burned. Yes?
So this is going to be a really weird question.
I love weird questions.
But-
Can't always answer them, but I love
Have
them.
you heard that, like, when you go down in altitude, like, if you're drinking, you get, like, drunk faster? What happens with that?
Drunk faster at a lower altitude?
Yeah. Or maybe it's...
I think higher.
Higher,
I have to say, when we go backpacking or when we go camping, I can't drink as much as I can when I'm at home. And I can drink even more when I go back to England. So,
So why is that?
I suspect that it's to do with the fact that the alcohol passes through the intestinal wall faster. But I don't know for sure. But that's what I suspect. But yeah, it does happen. Okay, so we looked at half of this diagram, sea level half, earlier in the semester. All right? So here we have barometric pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury. We've got nice high partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere, so it's very easy to get oxygen into the lungs and then out of the lungs and into the bloodstream. And we've got a nice diffusion gradient, so we've got a nice steep pressure gradient between the blood and the muscle tissue of 60 millimeters of mercury. So it's very easy at sea level to move oxygen in and out of the lungs and into the muscle tissue for aerobic work. All right? What happens when we go to altitude, and this is really high, this is nearly 4,500 meters, so this is an extreme, this would be like climbing Mount Everest type event. But it shows you the problem quite clearly. Here we only have a barometric pressure of 460, so we've dropped 300 millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure of oxygen in the environment, in the atmosphere now, is 96 instead of 159. So the partial pressure of oxygen is much lower, and so my gradient is less steep to move the oxygen into the lungs and then out of the lungs and into the bloodstream. But it's not flat, so we can still move oxygen into the bloodstream. It's not as effective as it is at sea level, but it's workable, right? The bigger problem comes when we're trying to move the oxygen from the bloodstream into the muscle tissue. Because at that level, now my pressure gradient has dropped from 60 to 15. And that's where the real problem lies, is it's really hard to get the oxygen out of the bloodstream and into the muscle tissue so that we can metabolize ATP aerobically. So this is a problem, but it's manageable. The real problem comes here. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. So it's not that I have no oxygen, it's that I've got less saturation and less pressure, and so my pressure gradient between the bloodstream, the capillaries, and the muscle tissue is really low. So, what are some of the things that are going on physiologically other than the fact that we're having a problem moving that oxygen around as well as we would like to? So something else you're going to see occur is that your resting heart rate, not just your heart rate when you're working out, but your resting heart rate will increase quite a lot because you've got a decreased stroke volume, you've got this low partial pressure of oxygen, and so your heart rate starts to beat higher to try to deliver more blood to the muscle tissue. We also see an increase in blood pressure, which hopefully for your athletes would not cause too much of a problem because their blood pressure is going to be normal or on the low end of normal, so a little bit of increase in blood pressure wouldn't be a problem. But if you're going on holiday with someone who already has high blood pressure, then going up the mountain is going to make them worse. And so they may need to adjust their medication or check with their doctor first before they go. Right? As we've said, oxygen transport is decreased, so we see lower saturation levels on the hemoglobin. And we see a decrease in VO2 max. Right? Because remember that VO2 max is not the amount of oxygen I'm breathing in, it's the amount of oxygen that is getting used at the tissue level. Right? So because we're struggling to move the oxygen into the tissues, we see a drop in VO2 max. We also see increases in catecholamines, so norepinephrine and epinephrine, and all those indicators show the challenge that your body is under as you move up higher in altitude. Right? It becomes harder and harder to maintain homeostasis within the body. Right? Eventually we're going to see some increase in hemoglobin and red blood cell count. Takes a while. Initially, the first couple of weeks, you're likely to have greater risk of dehydration because the initial thing that happens is a drop in plasma volume. But then if you stay up there for long enough, by about 3 weeks, you're going to start to increase red blood cell production. And the longer you're up there, the better that is. So that's the body's response. Remember we mentioned that EPO yesterday. The EPO is released in response to the drop in oxygen saturation. And the EPO stimulates the bone marrow to make more red blood cells. So it takes a while, it takes several weeks, and then you've got to stay up there long enough. But eventually, you'll have a higher red blood count without cheating and doing the things we talked about yesterday. Right? So we see some other responses as well, not just heart rate and blood pressure. If you go up high enough, so as I said, the top of Sandia Peak is about 10,000 feet. Cloudcroft is just under 10,000 feet, I think. There's several other places in the state where you can get up to 13,000 feet. Pikes Peak in Colorado goes up to, I think, 13.5, something like that. So, you know, going up above 10,000 feet is feasible given where we live. Okay? So, up until that high, really you don't see too much change in the breathing rate and the depth of breathing. But once we get up to this 10,000 feet, then we start to see the individual starts to breathe more deeply. All right, so they take a deeper breath. And then if you add exercise onto that, then you'll also see that breathing rate is higher than it would be for that exercise at a lower altitude. Right. At the end of the day, though, ventilation has a finite boundary on it. My lungs are only so big, right? I can only expand my rib cage so much, and so there's a max that I can manage that isn't going to change whether I'm at sea level or whether I'm up the mountain. So it adds like a ceiling. It becomes a sort of limitation to what I can do up the mountain. Is I can't breathe any faster or any deeper at maximal exercise than I can at maximal exercise down at sea level. Okay. So one of the other things that occurs is similar to the idea that we talked about with the swimmers, right? We said that the swimmers blow off carbon dioxide so that they can hold their breath under the water, okay? Well, when you are breathing more rapidly like this, you cause a similar effect. You end up blowing off more carbon dioxide, and so it changes the pH of the bloodstream and the tissues a little bit. So our oxyhemoglobin curve shifts to the left to try to allow for the oxygen to be unloaded off of the hemoglobin in response to the loss of carbon dioxide. So it all gets kind of squiffy unless you live there. People who live at altitude seem to adapt and don't have quite the same issues. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that because of the decreased partial pressure of the oxygen, we can't make ATP as effectively as we're used to aerobically, and so we shift a little bit towards using glycolysis, using an anaerobic mechanism for making ATP. Right? And so when we are working at submax levels, where we would imagine that we would be working aerobically, instead of being maybe, let's say, make up numbers 80% aerobic and 20% anaerobic, what we find is that we're actually working at 65% aerobic and 35% anaerobic. All right? So that means that we get fatigued a little bit quicker. It means that we're relying on glycolysis, which means we're relying more on carbohydrate than we would expect to for a walk, maybe if I'm going hiking. We see an increase in blood lactate levels. Okay. And so when we are, so if you're planning, so let's say you're planning on a competition that's at altitude, or you're planning on going camping that's at altitude, it means that you have to allow for an increase in your carbohydrate intake to allow for the increase in using glycolysis as an energy system. Right? So it's always a good idea to pack some carbs if you're going for a day hike, or like when I do my snowshoe race, I always have sultanas ready to shove down my throat, and then I'll have a banana and a sandwich back at the car for the end of the race. because you use carbs so much faster than you would expect to for that workload at a lower level. Right? Now, if you've been training or if you live at altitude, right, so you're acclimatized to that level, then when you come down the mountain, you're able to rely a little bit on fat metabolism for aerobic work than someone who's not been working up at high altitude. So that's a benefit because, remember, my fat metabolism is a little bit slower, but it provides heaps of energy. And the longer I can delay using my glycogen stores, the longer I can go before I hit the wall. Right? So that's a benefit that would be a chronic adaptation. You have to have been up at altitude long enough to become acclimatized to being up there. So when we look at performances in anaerobic, short duration, kind of high-ish intensity type event versus a long duration aerobic event. So the effect of altitude on an anaerobic event is relatively minimal, because I don't need the oxygen to compete, right? If I'm having to do lots of anaerobic work with breaks but continuous, like a football game, then you would expect to see some impact on performance for a football player. That's why, as I mentioned yesterday, if football teams from low altitudes go to play in Denver, then you'll often see them resorting to those oxygen tanks. So it's possible then that if the athlete thinks that they'll have an impact on their performance, because they don't understand the difference between anaerobic and aerobic, for example, then we may see some performance impacts. The other thing that we see is because the pressure, the air pressure is lower, you see really fast times in sprint races. And you see longer triple and long jumps, and longer javelin and shot put throws. Because the object moving through the air moves through the air a little bit quicker because there's less pressure in the air, right? So a lot of world records were set when the Olympics were in Mexico City, and some of them probably still hold, and if they don't, they've only just been broken. I mean, they've lasted a long, long time because Mexico was very high, and we haven't had another Olympic Games that was up that high, right? So there's some benefit to anaerobic performances at altitude. When we look at our distance performances, then speed tends to be lower, so we don't see world records broken in the marathon and the 10,000 meters in Mexico City, right? Or in the cycling races, okay? And this, can't see it very well here, but this is in your book. I think it's actually a really interesting graph because it shows you the predicted change in performance time by altitude and race length. So here are long races, they get slower, and here are shorter races, maybe get a bit faster. So I would look at those graphs when you're going through, because it's actually really an an interesting piece of information to look at and try to go, oh, okay, so where's the next World Championships? Where's the next Olympics? What are our chances of getting world records there? Right? So let me go back before we start the illnesses. The recommendation at the moment, based on what we currently know about physiology and adaptation to altitude, is that athletes should try to live high but train low. And part of the reason for that is if I live high, I'm going to get the benefit. But if I try to train high, then my performance is going to be decreased. And so I'm not training at my optimal level, right? So I imagine in this area, you could live in Ruidoso, but drive to Roswell or Portales to do your training. So maybe you go home and you live in Ruidoso Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Monday you come over to Portales, you train Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday really hard, and then you do your lighter training sessions back up at altitude, and you do your heavy training sessions below 5,000 feet, right? So we're pretty lucky in our kind of layout here that we would be able maybe to fulfill the recommendation of live high, train low. But a lot of people don't, you know, I mean, for some people to get somewhere high enough to get the adaptation, that would cost a lot of money, right? And it's a point of controversy when you get to World Championship and Olympic level, because it's not cheating to live at altitude, but the physiological benefit and the performance benefit is huge if you're an aerobic athlete. And so then you've got people who don't live at altitude but have money. Now we've got Olympic committees and things providing oxygen tents for their athletes so they can sleep in an oxygen tent at high altitude and train at low altitude outside the oxygen tent. Well, that's controversial because those things are really expensive, and that's giving that person a massive benefit, but not everybody can afford it. So it's a benefit that you can only get if you've got enough dosh. So it's a pretty argumentative point, this idea of oxygen tents and things. Okay, now I'm actually going to switch out because my slide on that slideshow is boring, and this one is more fun to look at. All right, so going up in altitude, particularly if you go quickly, can cause some physiological problems. So altitude sickness is a pathological condition, and it may require medical attention depending upon how bad it becomes. All right? So it's caused by the reduction in the pressure of oxygen and the availability of oxygen to the hemoglobin. So the first level of altitude sickness is acute mountain sickness, AMS. AMS can occur in anybody, although it does seem to occur a little bit more often in female recreational athletes rather than males. So, you know, if a big group of you go camping, the girls might have a few more headaches and nausea than the boys do, possibly. It's gonna impact anywhere from, bless you, 2 to 7 days. And you probably got to get to about 8,000 feet before you're likely to have the problems. As I said, particularly if you go up quickly. All right? Symptoms, headaches, nausea, maybe feeling a bit weak, so because my muscles haven't got the oxygen, so my contraction is a little off. Shortness of breath, difficulty sleeping often occurs. So if you go camping just for the weekend, then you may sleep really badly that weekend. Don't go camping at altitude the weekend before finals. Don't go there. That would be a bad plan, right? And some individuals suffer a loss of appetite, which can be problematical if you are working with athletes, because obviously if they're not eating enough calories, then that is also going to impact performance for them, right? So, I'll come back to the medication at the end. Let me go to the next one first. Level 2 of our altitude sickness is high altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE. So if you ignore the symptoms of your acute mountain sickness and you continue going up in altitude, then you can develop HAPE. All right? HAPE can be life-threatening because the water in your cells and in the bloodstream, your blood plasma volume, gets drawn into the lungs. And so you start to develop fluid on the lungs, which makes breathing even more difficult. Right? And then again, if we keep going and we still don't pay attention, then you can develop high altitude cerebral edema. So not just the fluid on your lungs, but now you have fluid within the cranial cavity that is pushing on very delicate brain tissue. So this is dead, right? If you don't get off the mountain very quickly, this is dead. So you have to be able to call in maybe a rescue helicopter that can lift you down. If you don't have GPS or you don't have a phone and they can't find you, there's not much chance of surviving that for very long. Right? So if your person starts vomiting, or this headache is really excruciating, then these symptoms are getting worse. Right? And I have a friend who was hiking with a friend, and he got the acute mountain sickness, and it probably got to this level before they were able to get him out, because they had gone in so far, it took so long to get back out. So he was pretty lucky. Remember that dehydration is much easier to develop at altitude. So you've got to keep drinking, and that's part of the problem, is that some of the, especially like the headache and the nausea, if you're dehydrated, you can get headaches and feel nauseous, right? So many people mistake the symptoms for the altitude sickness to be dehydration symptoms, and they don't take them seriously enough. Right? There is a drug, I'm not sure if I can say this word, acetazolamine, which is supposed to help the side effects, prevent those side effects of going up in altitude. The research literature says, though, that it impairs physical performance. So it might not be a good idea for athletes to take the drug that would stop them getting the headaches and the nausea if it's going to impair their biking or running or snowshoeing or cross-country skiing performance, whatever they're doing. Right? So the best way to reduce the chances of developing any sickness are all very well, but they may not be very realistic. All right, we've got to go up slowly. We shouldn't go up more than 9.5 to 1,000 feet per day, particularly once we're up high. We need to limit our initial exertion. So, if you are lucky enough to be able to take your athletes to go train at altitude for a week, the first couple of days you have to lower the intensity of the workout. Right? You can't expect them to work as hard as they worked 5,000 to 6,000 feet lower down the first couple of days. Right? And those hydration plans that we talked about are really important, that people maintain their hydration status as much as possible.
So,
Yes?
so do you think like how people, when they like climb like a mountain or something, when they go like really high up, like they say like some people have died like doing that, do you think like most of that came from like stuff like that, or rather than the cold?
Bit of both, probably.
Like
I suspect that, I don't know, but I would suspect that they probably started to develop this. That slowed them down. The slower I move, the harder it is to maintain body heat. And then you develop hypothermia. And if your hypothermia is to the point where you pass out and you're not with someone, chances are you won't come back around. You know, I mean, you won't know you're dying because you'll be unconscious. So that's a good thing, I think. I'd rather not know myself.
So would it be more likely for one of those to happen rather than just developing hypothermia?
I just think they could be linked. I mean, the hypothermia, especially these days when the equipment and the clothing is so sophisticated, to go up and just get too cold, I mean, that's idiotic, really, given the availability of good equipment now. So I don't think that professional mountaineers who go up and die of the cold just got cold. I mean, they either got hurt and they couldn't move, or they developed at least hay and they couldn't move fast enough, or they get snowed in for some reason, there's an avalanche, or they lose their equipment off a cliff. I mean, you can't, someone who really knows what they're doing doesn't go up and just get cold. I mean, the equipment is too sophisticated, in my view, anyway. I mean, the equipment I have is pretty sophisticated, and I'm just go backpacking in the wilderness, you know, and it's pretty sophisticated. So people that are doing that stuff really know what they're doing. At Everest, they have base camp. That's pretty high. So if you do a trip to Everest, what they'll do is they'll walk you into base camp, and you have to stay there for quite a long time, and then they'll start to take you up on the climbs and the walks from base camp. But they get you to base camp first and acclimatize you before they take you any further.
So they have somebody with them when they do that stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. But, you know, I mean, professionals make mistakes and things happen that you can't. There were 3 climbers died in California last week. Really, really experienced climbers got caught in an avalanche. I mean, there's nothing you can do. The avalanche would have made, they probably were pinned in, but the rock slipped and the pin came out. Once the top person falls off, he pulls the next person with him, and now you've got 2 people and you're the only, you're not hanging on. So it's a dangerous game. I mean, it looks like it's a lot of fun. I wouldn't do it. I mean, Everest and mountain rock climbing aren't my thing. But, I mean, I can see where it's a real rush, and the views must be unbelievably stunning, but it's not safe. I mean, you've got to do your research. Okay, so let's go back to collaborate. See what else we've got. Where are we in time? Oh, okay. So we're going to look at adaptations, theory. Okay, we've only got 2 more slides then on the altitude, and then we'll start the heat, and then you guys will need to cover the cold, because then on Wednesday I will do a very reduced special populations lecture. Friday will be review, Monday will be exam.
And that chapter 15 that we went over yesterday?
Yes,
That's on our test list?
yes, and, where did I just put it?
Chapter
Wait, I just had it right there.
11 and 15.
Sarah. Oh, it's here. Okay, here we go. If you want to review it, or for those people that weren't here yesterday, go into the lecture rooms, click on the YouTube link. Don't go to the HPE 330 Spring 19 because it isn't in there because I didn't video it yesterday. All right? You want to go to the HPE 313 XPhys class lectures folder and find the recording for April the 27th, 2017. And that is the lab lecture on chapter 15. Okay? And I haven't put out anything about boundaries on chapter 15, but it is in my head to try and remember to do that. Can't guarantee I will, but I will try.
Okay.